it's very difficult to say where the new talent will come from. It goes in cycles. There was a period in the late 50s where the Actors Studio turned out a group of actors that all went on to be movie stars, and big name movie stars. There was a time when there was a group of actors that came out of daytime television, soap operas, that all went on to become big movie stars. The current trend is more toward television stars that have made the crossover from television series leads to movie star. And then there's cases where, just somebody happened to be in the right place at the right time and allowed themselves to be lucky.
Every time you see one of those little lights flash, it's somebody asking for a job. Every time you hear them say, try later, it means there isn't any job. You can't keep the girls at the switchboard long, they'll go crazy. Every one of those little lights thought he was going to be a star. Still want to go into movies? You know what your chances are? 1 in 100,000.
But maybe I'm that one.
While Americans fought in the Great War to end all wars, over there, a new amusement was diverting crowds across the country at home. Vaudeville was fast becoming a king under siege as a more democratic pastime captured imaginations in city after city. If Nickelodeon's had been the poor man's show, the feature-length film would be entertainment for everyone. Technological improvements and post-war optimism only fueled the public's demand for motion pictures.
World War I is over. The public's enthusiasm for movies now results in the growth of theater chains.
Before the 20s could roar in, wonderful, alluring picture palaces were springing up in towns throughout America, and we, the people, surrendered wholly to the magic of the movies.
When people talk about Griffith, the father of the fiction film, they always say, the great, marvelous thing that he did was he individuated the player, the close-up. He moved the camera closer and, he, in a sense, created this type of space that is very natural to endemic to film. You could never get as close in any other art form or medium like you could in movies because of the close-up. But Griffith did another thing, too, that a lot of people don't realize, and that is his cinema is not only a cinema of close-up, but a cinema of recording of masses. As such, the movies, we can study faces, we can study eyes through the close-up, and of course the eyes, the way to the soul, we can study interior people, but now, because film also records masses, large arrays of people at once, it is a way, through this representation of masses and large crowds, it's a way for mass society to study and examine itself as mass, as crowd.
A reliable California climate and a lower cost of living had attracted movie producers to Hollywood long before the war. The fledgling studios, in turn, had drawn hundreds of craftsmen, technicians, and writers to the West. Now scores of stage actors and actresses were moving from the East to this new entertainment capital. The movie industry was in high gear. Big, spectacular pictures directed by early Hollywood legends D.W. Griffith and C.B. DeMille featured breathtaking crowd scenes with hundreds, even thousands of extras. Audiences were electrified and literally drawn to the process.
The movies by 1918, 1919 were a phenomenon that had now moved well beyond the penny arcades and the world of vaudeville and the world of working class entertainment. They had now come to be part of a largely acceptable middle class culture. And ordinary kids, ordinary middle class kids, were flocking to the movies. Kids suddenly found themselves not just identifying with the movies and the excitement they saw on the screen, but with the actors themselves. And in a way, maybe the star system begins with this initial identification of kids sitting alone in darkened theaters.
As the more ambitious studios built networks of theaters to increase and consolidate their control of the industry, their producers recognized the power of the star to fill seats. The press caught on too, as editors quickly discovered that articles written about the characters in Hollywood were eagerly devoured by large numbers of readers. Talk about pulp fiction. Between 1912 and 1920 alone, a dozen weekly and monthly publications devoted solely to the movies raced to press. No information seemed too trivial for the millions of fans whose appetite for intimate details seemed insatiable. These stories helped to fill the theaters, all right, but they also ignited a frenzy that attracted thousands of screen hopefuls from across America. Very quickly, Hollywood became one of the most famous spots on the globe.
Pretty girls and handsome young men flocked to the glamour town, seeking fame and fortune. For show business people, Hollywood is now the big time.
Being an extra, I loved every minute of it. I had done all kinds of little jobs in New York when I was studying music, and I was bored by most of them. I tried selling advertising. I wasn't good at it. I worked in the General Motors Acceptance Corporation. I didn't like it. I tried this, I tried that. But the freedom of being an extra and being around talent all the time. And in those days, we went to the vaudeville shows, we went to burlesque shows.
Hollywood took a system that vaudeville used, which was the star system, but just amplified it even more. I mean, a great performance, a great image by Mary Pickford or Charlie Chaplin could be captured and then shown over and over again. It didn't rely on somebody going on a train from city to city to city. And there became many stories and folk tales of people being discovered and plucked out of being an extra or found at a party or seen somewhere and instantly becoming a star.
Enough of these kids, thousands by 1920 and 21, were convinced, either by winning talent shows or by the flattery of their parents and peers, that they could make it in the movies. And as a result, day after day, busload after busload, train after train, disgorged these hopefuls into a Hollywood community that was suffering high unemployment, into a Los Angeles that was suffering high unemployment, and into a Los Angeles that was a notoriously anti-union town. There was not much work for them. Most of these people were never going to have a chance even to play a bit part in the movies. And they found themselves sucked into the maw of the casual labor force, the world of the extra.
West, Crosby, Dietrich. But what about the unknowns, the extras, the faces in the mob scenes? Are they real, these people who wear numbers instead of names?
This massive talent pool proved to be a double-edged sword for harassed studio executives who complained of the influx of thousands of movie-mad girls from east, west, north, south, from cities, villages, and farms, from every social class and intellectual level. One historian wrote, "If you look west from Iowa," he asked, "what do you see? Arid plains, mountains, intermountain deserts, and still more mountains. But over that final range is paradise." The end of the war had ushered into vogue the new morality of the jazz era. Movie scripts began to depict adultery, divorce, drinking, and even drug-taking. As American films became increasingly sophisticated and risque, the myth of Hollywood as Babylon was born.
They find in blatant sex a powerful box office attraction. The public begins to confuse the wild parties they see on the screen with the actual life in Hollywood.
In some cases, the truth was stranger than fiction.
There were private parties in different places, particularly in San Francisco, where one of the famous silent clowns, Roscoe Arbuckle, had a major party because he just signed a contract with Paramount for over $1 million. After the whole event was over with, someone was found dead. A woman was found dead in one of these beds in one of the rooms in the hotel. Now immediately it was Arbuckle that was accused of having something to do with this death. So they were very confused and upset about this, and then there were several other scandals that happened shortly thereafter. The Wallace Reed death, he was a famous actor at the time who overdosed on morphine. And then the last one, the William Desmond Taylor murder. He was a famous silent film director who was murdered, and it was an unsolved murder, and women were involved, actresses were involved, young ones particularly. That was enough.
But the scandal seemed to only fuel the flow of would-be stars into Hollywood. By the mid-1920s, the streets of Los Angeles were teeming with hopefuls. They gathered daily, randomly, in outdoor interview yards at the studios, seeking something, anything, in the way of a bit part. No studio offered regular or steady employment to extra players, requiring that those seeking these jobs make daily rounds to each of the lots. Often they carried multiple changes of wardrobe and props to enhance their chances with casting directors. In many cases, so-called employment agents would direct the hopeful extras to studio bullpens for what became known as cattle calls. Those who were lucky enough to be hired for a day were often charged fees of 7% or more of their salaries, which in most cases was $3.20 plus a box lunch. Creating additional hardship for these background players, agents would also require extras to return to their offices to collect their wages for the day's work and to pay the placement fee. It didn't matter. As one reporter wrote, once they got a day's work in as an extra, no other work would do. Forever after, they referred to themselves as motion picture actors. It was as if they were infected with the disease. Yet most of those out there on the streets are failures in the unending struggle for existence. Some of the disillusioned seekers of fame and fortune found employment in offices, retail stores, and restaurants. By the mid-1920s, there were so many trenchant young women in Hollywood that matrons at the police stations had to find lodgings and food for many, whose visions of stardom had faded into a harsh reality.
Oh, what's that up there?
Oh, that's Busby Berkeley on his flying trapeze. He uses that to get all those overhead shots he's so famous for. There's Ruby Keeler, rehearsing one of her dances.
The studios needed a constant supply of labor to fuel the machine and a pipeline of talent with star potential.
Hello, Lyle. How are
Hello,
you?
Buzz.
Buzz, this is Miss Howson. Mr. Berkeley.
So glad to know you, Miss Howson. Another candidate for the chorus?
No, just a visitor. But I've often wondered where you get all those beautiful girls.
You do, huh? Well, they come from all over. You see, they might come from California, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Texas. Really doesn't matter. See, there are beautiful girls everywhere.
But stories of the abuse and even starvation of this immigrant talent pool created bad press for the most image-conscious of industries. Already accused of corrupting public morals, the producers, after hoping for several years that the madness would exhaust itself, organized an educational campaign to keep new screen hopefuls at home. This stay-away propaganda included studio trailers and magazine articles calculated to reduce the new movie fever.
What powerful urge keeps Hollywood's hopefuls everlastingly at it? Genevieve? Why are you here?
Everybody back in Birmingham knows I'm out here. They expect me to quit. I'm not going back there and be the laughing stock.
How about you, Grace?
That's what I said 14 years ago. Now I'm satisfied with a job. I've got 3 children to support.
Goldie, what dreams, what ideals keep you here?
I hung around New York so long I got to be a landmark. People used to point me out like the Statue of Liberty. I'm going to grab off some old guy with lots of dough.
Suzanne, what about you?
Someday, somehow, I'm going to be, well, maybe not a star, but a real actress.
Pride, necessity, adventure, ambition. From the ends of the earth they come, waiting for the magic call.
Snap into it, girls. You're 5 minutes late now.
At one point, Mrs. C.B. DeMille and other wives of Hollywood moguls helped to create and publicize special residences for young women seeking work in the movies.
And in trying to clean up their image, they were talking to the press about cleaning up the coast bums and getting rid of them. At the same time, they were hosting these beauty contests and talent searches that were bringing hundreds more in. And so they were definitely contributing to the problem. At the same time, they were talking to the press about how this problem needed to be resolved.
In the meantime, legally constituted methods offered by the California State Labor Commission for protecting labor had had little success in remedying the poor working and living conditions for the extra. Ongoing stories of abuse produced an unprecedented storm of public outcry from mainstream magazines like Good Housekeeping. Ministers and priests forbade congregations to go to movies, creating even greater tension for a studio system largely headed by immigrant Jews. Women's clubs and other reformers demanded a mass boycott. By 1922, 36 states and the federal government were considering enacting censorship laws. Fearing a moralistic backlash, worried producers formed a self-regulatory trade organization, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America.
To avoid federal censorship, the film industry forms the Motion Picture Producers Association. They appoint Will Hayes to become their so-called czar. The Hayes office becomes the watchdog of movie morality.
The producers realized that calls for regulation of the movies, calls to clean up Hollywood, could ultimately lead to the shutting down of their industry. And it was because of the threat to their industry and their way of life that they were so eager to find a means to put a better face on themselves to the American public. And it's the face of Will Hayes that they seized upon.
Following the example of Major League Baseball that had survived the shoeless Joe Jackson scandal, the industry appointed a conservative federal judge to oversee its operations. In a bold move, they hired Will Hayes, President Harding's Postmaster General, a conservative Republican, Mason, Kiwanian, Rotarian, and Presbyterian elder from Indiana. Hayes' presence made the industry's gesture of self-censorship convincing to the public and government alike. Hayes believed that vice could be flaunted for 6 reels as long as virtue triumphed in the 7th. The main task of the Hayes office in the 20s would be to stave off the threat of government censorship by appeasing pressure groups, managing news, deflecting scandal, and generally inhibiting close scrutiny of the industry. He found the perfect cause in the now notorious plight of the Hollywood extra.
All right, now you people. You townspeople over beyond the gates there. Yes, now as these crusaders come riding through, you're seeing a great movement, a great sweeping forward of these men who are leaving you, perhaps for all time. They're your fathers, your brothers, your husbands. Let me see that in your faces. Come on now, work yourselves into the emotion of such a scene. Don't be extras. Be a nation watching its manhood ride out on a great cause, the crusade. Are you ready to...
Hayes noted, Unlike most industries confronted with simpler problems of decasualization, we are up against a vast multitude of people who have daydreamed and wish-thought themselves into believing that they are potential stars. The extra is not an apprentice or a kind of junior grade actor who may, simply because he is an extra, aspire to better roles. Unlike Napoleon's recruit, he carries no marshal's baton in his knapsack. It is notable that of the thousands of people that have been extras at one time or another, not more than a dozen have risen to stardom. Hayes believed that he couldn't save the fools from their folly, but once they were set on it, it would be possible to remove some of the hazards of their adventure. That would be his job.
All right, cut.
And it's with that in mind that he approached probably the nation's leading expert on women's labor, certainly one of its leading industrial sociologists, the director of industrial studies at the Russell Sage Foundation, Mary Van Cleek. Van Cleek's solution was a simple one. We must take the profit motive out of the effort to link the worker with the studio, and we must make the worker part of a regular and orderly central filing system so that the studio and the worker can more easily and more readily meet each other at the point where the studio's needs and the worker, the potential worker's qualifications meet. This was the Central Casting Bureau.
The Central Casting Corporation was founded on January 26, 1926, funded by the board of the West Coast Association that issued $30,000 of stock, 60% put up by First National, MGM, Universal, and Fox, 40% by the lesser studio corporations. It opened for business on March 27, 1927, exactly 1 year after the report based on Van Cleek's survey was issued. It was housed in the Guarantee Building on Hollywood Boulevard.
Let us select offhand Hollywood Extra Girl number 1472. Take her apart and discover what makes her tick. To find her, we merely dial Garfield 3711 and get
Central Casting, file room.
The Bureau used both male and female interviewers to screen applicants. Studios now paid the commissions and all placements were free. Shortly after it opened, an industry publication reported that hereafter, female applicants must meet certain well-defined tests as to character and intelligence, as well as screen adaptability. Thus, that important factor of maintaining a proper moral standard is assured, in addition to the more commercial aspect of building up a working force that will meet all the innumerable demands of the various productions. The Central Casting offices open at 6 o'clock each weekday morning and stayed open far into the night. Registered extras seeking work were told to call once an hour during the day until about 3 p.m., after which they could call every 15 minutes to see if jobs were available for the following day. At first, calls swamped the office and all but wrecked the Hollywood Central Exchange. The phone company then assigned the Bureau an exchange all its own.
You would call your name in or call somebody else's name in. You would do that incessantly, mostly after 4 o'clock. And somebody would say, give my name in, will you? Sure, you know, and vice versa. And I generally knew what was going on, whether the girls were wearing that kind of a formal or how many days or whether it was night work. And it was just a camaraderie. There wasn't class distinction, you know. Just to be on the set, you had to have a little something, and people were known as being ex-fighters or ex-this and that, and you'd be cast accordingly. And also, if you had good Western wardrobe or good dude ranch clothes, good formal clothes, it all helped. But to be with Central, it meant something.
When an extra called, he or she was given one of 6 replies by the operators. Hold the line, try later, no work, men only, women only, call station M. But Hayes reinforced that the wages paid had little to do with acting ability. This was because the casting corporation, the studios, and to a certain extent, the guild, wanted to make it clear to extras that they were not potential actors and were employed solely on the basis of appearance or physical type.
You will always notice the fellows that worked well had the feel. They were with it. And despite the fact that they were very minute, they could have spoiled the picture, like some guys stare, you know.
Extras reporting to Central Casting were asked to submit to a ruthless self-appraisal of physical characteristics. On the registration form, they were required to check under the heading legs the following: long, medium, short, bony, fat, skinny, elephantiasis, bow-legged, knock-kneed, or straight. Under face, categories included bearded, mustache, clean-shaven, freckles, dreamy, pockmarked, scarred, broken nose, chinless, round, long, or thin. As an example, the daily requests pouring into the Central Casting Corporation from the studios might include 85 Mexican types, must be emaciated and look starved and desperate. A stout man with one leg, a kind face, and an English accent who can act. One rubber-faced man who must put lower lip over nose. One practical oyster opener who can open an oyster as it should be opened. One fire eater and one sword swallower. 4 real Eskimo. 10 people to represent various breeds of dogs, to sit around a table and play cards as replicas of the famous picture.
And Central Casting, of course, was great. If they liked you at Central Casting, you had it made, because they could use you on this, they could use you on that.
In the first 3 months that the Bureau was open, 60% of the total registrants were women. 60,000 jobs to extras were given out, and it was estimated that 300,000 placements would be the total for the first fiscal year. The actual record during Central Casting's first year for one day's placement was 2,500, and the minimum, 85. But from the industry's viewpoint, the Central Casting office was a great success.
And so every studio could have access to this one agency. It was a very professional way of doing it, as opposed to the old days when people would just show up at a studio gate and ask for the casting director and say, I want to be in a film.
Film Daily triumphed. In a few isolated cases, the mainstream press tried to convince the world at large that Hollywood had become a menace to the morals of the nation. Then, with one quiet little move, the powers that be solved the problem and robbed the sensation mongers of their ammunition.
Even after the formation of Central Casting and into the early 1930s, people who were registered with the Bureau were lucky to get 10 to 11 days work per year. Those who were called back often were the favorites of the studios.
The charges and countercharges of favoritism and worker exploitation continued, as did the public relations wars waged by the studios and their assortment of critics. Some 20 years later, Will Hayes would write, "The Central Casting Bureau is a Hollywood institution and a monument to the enlightened sentiments of the industry as a whole."
There was this myth about working up through the ranks and this kind of mobility that didn't actually happen a lot.
There were just enough successes to keep the legends going, and there was always legends. That Lana Turner was sitting at Schwab's drugstore one day, and some talent scout or studio employee happened in and had some project in his mind, and looked and said, "Oh, this is the perfect person," and brings her to the studio, and she works out instantly, and almost overnight, she's a star. I mean, there was just enough of that legend perpetuated by the Hollywood legendary star-making machine to keep people coming.
It would seem that 80 years later, not a whole lot has changed.
The problem with going to sit on the stool at Schwab's is Schwab's is not there anymore, both literally and figuratively. That's really trying to capture lightning in a jar.
My name is Christopher Roberts. I've been in Hollywood about 18 years. I've done 28 films, but I've only had speaking parts in about 7 of them. I got my first speaking part by calling Burt Reynolds from Mississippi about 18 or 19 years ago. When I got him on the phone, I did a lot of different voices. I say, "Is Burt there? Could I speak to him?"
Is Mr. Reynolds there? Oh, yes, Mr. Bird. He hasn't missed him, but the Ku Klux is after me. Please help me.
But I speak to him sometime if I'm someone else get boarded. Scarlett, you're the damnedest woman I've ever seen.
Central Casting.
Flash discovery aside, the reality is that working as an extra is not a very good way to build a career as a legitimate film actor. But Hollywood extras have always loved a challenge, and today hordes of hopefuls still flock to open call days at this latter-day Central Casting Bureau.
But I know that Dr. Quinn, we're still waiting to hear from CBS. So as soon as I hear from Dr. Quinn on whether or not they're back, I'll be happy to get your picture out there and get you over there for the next season. They'll be starting up in July. Okay? All right.
This is Central Casting. Central Casting is a company that provides the service of hiring extras for producers of television, feature film, commercials. And we also are become the employer of record for those people as well. It's a service we provide to these customers. We hire them and payroll them.
Guys, Trisha Gomez is here. Take a look at the window. Lovely young woman is Trisha Gomez. SAG, and we'll work after her.
We're pretty much a clearinghouse for people that want to be extras in the movie industry. And they come up to our office and get registered with us, and then subsequently to that, they capture their image in our computer, which each of us have on our desk. We also put them on a Rolodex card for a Rolodex file. We have that file as well. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, we have what we call visiting extras that are already registered with us, can come up between 9:30 and 10:30 in the morning, and so to speak, say hi to the casting directors, let their faces be seen. And I've always told extras over the years, you got to have some kind of a little gimmick, something that'll stick in the mind of a casting director, and something that you say or something that you do or something that reminds them that it's you, just something different.
I'm Sheila.
Sheila.
I'm also an entertainer. I'm a showwoman. I sing and I dance.
Here we go.
Smile if your heart is breaking. Smile. La da dee da dee da. Da da da. Gucci, Gucci, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hello. I was on the Keenan show. I love show business. Where can I leave you? What are you doing here?
I think that being in the right place, maybe at the right time, and you might be doing a little small part that might lead to a big one.
I was born and raised here. I do this as a career. I've been doing this for about 24 years.
You got to promote yourself, and one way to promote yourself is stand in these lines and, solicit yourself, get work.
So I have to work. I like to work. I don't want to sit still. I get too old to dig ditches. Somebody told me about this. I get into it about 1.5 years, 2 years ago.
I do a Christmas gig back on the East Coast every year. I have for the last 7 years. I've done about 5 years here on the West Coast.
I was driving up from Indianapolis to Chicago doing extra work, which is a 2.5-hour drive, and this was non-union extra work at the time. And I was on the set of 3 movies, and on every set, everybody was going, "You came up from Indianapolis to do this? Why?" I'm like, "I want to get into the business and see what it's all about." And, making $40 as an extra, so I was pretty much losing money driving from Indianapolis up to Chicago. And I was telling them, well, I'm hoping that I could, somebody might see me and say, "Hey, we could use you for this part."
I did TV first, a television show with a bunch of kids. And then I did some extra work, things like everybody else did, little parts here and there in Hollywood, big rejections all over the place, and being an extra and trying, and just being brutalized by this business, as everyone else is.
Well, it seems like the people that I guess get in get work all the time, and then it's really hard to get into the in crowd. I mean, I'm with Studio Phone. I call the line all the time.
The public sees a glamorous business, and so many people who come out here who get their hearts broken, that's what they see. They don't realize it is a business. See, it's called show business. It's not called show art. And there is a business to this. And that business is very exact. It can be mean. It can be cruel. It can be rewarding. I don't know how else to describe it, but most people who go home early don't realize that when they get here.
This business is built on rejection. So I would go in, sometimes I'd feel elated, and sometimes I wouldn't if I got the part. And then as I progressed, it was still rejection. I remember one time on a show, everybody else came and they were supposed to be 15-year-olds, and they were dressed in satin dresses. I was the only one that looked like what they wanted as a schoolgirl. And I was selected, and they turned around to me and had me stand out, and they said to all the other young people, "This is what we want you to look like, not something that you look like a hooker going down Hollywood Boulevard."
He said, "You're never going to make it in this business." And as illustration of the difference between myself and a successful candidate for this job, he said when Tony Curtis was first in a movie, he delivered a bag of groceries. And you took one look at that guy and you knew that was a movie star. And I leaned across his desk and, out of the depths of my ignorance, said, "Well, I thought you were supposed to think it was a grocery delivery boy." And of course, he threw my ass out of his office immediately.
I am a Native American. When I'm lucky, I perform as a Native American actor or background. And when I can't get that, I play generic roles as Middle Easterns, Hispanics, Italians, anything that my look can go for, I've done. From very down homeless to a biker. And once in a while, if I'm very lucky and Central blesses me, I get to do an upscale thing.
Yeah, Friends gave us all that opportunity. All of a sudden, it was like getting a trump card or something. It was sort of acceptable, and it's just so funny because I was so afraid of movie auditions. I would cancel, I would freak out, I was intimidated. And then all of a sudden, you know, it's okay. They want you to be in the movies.
Summer of '73 came around. I was 12 years old. I auditioned for this film called Cornbread Earl in Maine. Got the gig, went to Los Angeles, made the movie, came back. And that was my first.
First film that I did was a film called Shout. It was like a teenage, it was John Travolta pre-comeback with Jamie Walters and Heather Graham. I had one line, it's my first movie.
The hardest part of this work for anyone, I don't care how well, unless you're really tight, is to get the job. The hardest part, because in the years when we were calling in, it was the rotary. You just for hours. You were able to call from, I think, 10 to 12, and then later 2 to 4. And then if you weren't booked by 4:30, you knew you weren't going to work the next day. And it still exists.
What was true when Will Hayes arrived in Hollywood is still true today. In the movie industry, the extra is considered atmosphere.
The extra is part of the filmmaking process as much as set design and art direction. Without drawing the ire of the Extra Guild, which they will probably do when they hear me say this, I say there's no great talent in being an extra. There's no great talent in walking from point A to point B pretending you're reading a newspaper or talking to somebody. It's something that most people can do. There's not a lot of money paid to atmosphere people. That is what they're referred to from time to time. They are essential to the art form.
You look at your most lauded films of all time, you look at them, and you will always find crowds and masses and extras. We all love Gone with the Wind. Look at that spectacle. One of the great shots in Gone with the Wind was made, you start with Vivian Leigh down in the marketplace, but what do? It's not just her. You pull back and back and back and back and back and get Atlanta.
Many of these background players, as they prefer to be called, do think of themselves as actors, despite the fact that day wages paid to these screen extras would not fully cover the cost of living in Hollywood today, any more than they did in 1920.
Average background person, from what I've seen, make about $5,000 a year. $5,000. On a bad year, well, I call it a bad year. You have to have your minimum amount, which is a bad year, which you can make your insurance, which is $7,500. And a good year, you can make, real good year with commercials, $30,000 to $40,000.
Just to become an extra and stay an extra, I wouldn't recommend it. It's too tough. You can't make a living at it, and it's a jungle out there.
Clearly, for many, there are other benefits to doing this type of work.
Better than staying home all day.
When people think about show business and they think about being successful, they have a tendency to think about the stars. That's their image of success. But almost everybody who goes into show business isn't trying to become rich and famous. They don't see that as very likely, and that really isn't their motivation. They just want to work.
You have to learn what you want out of the system. There are a lot of people who come out to California or go to New York who just want to act. They just want to be actors. I want to be a working actor. And you've seen them in 100 things, and you probably, if they put a gun to your head, you couldn't tell me their names. Those people are just as happy. So it depends on what somebody wants out of the situation. That's the first question you ask yourself when you get up in the morning. What do I want out of this?
Don't get into this business. Save yourself. Actually, no, I'm reminded. One of my first jobs here was an extra in a commercial, and John Daner was the featured performer on the spot. And I asked him, all wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, what advice he would give to an aspiring actor, and he said, "Get out while you can." I didn't take his advice because I was, filled with something else. And I must say, statistically, I've had a very successful career, although I'm probably fairly obscure.
Like beauty itself, star quality may be in the eye of the beholder. So how does one break into the movies?
Must have work.
Allow yourself to be lucky. And by that I mean everybody has opportunities at one time or another to perform, to shine, to, as they say, show what they can do. And you have to be able to be prepared so that when that does happen to you, you can take advantage.
Sometimes you wind up taking small roles, and they turn out to be something quite delicious. Richard Benjamin was directing his first film, My Favorite Year, but I was looking for a way to embellish my role, which was non-speaking, by the way. And when I made my entrance, everything around, there was a guy who had just been kicked in the shins and was jumping up and down on one foot going, "Oh!" And I just took a cue from that and began to do this tap dance and started punching the guy, the goon next to me. And Richard said, "Oh gosh, we gotta include that in the film." And I can't tell you how many people have recognized me on the street from that one moment. So I always refer to that as my favorite moment.
Many insiders would argue that in some ways Hollywood today is still a small town, offering big opportunities for the lucky and talented who can tough it out. But Hollywood today is also a multi-billion-dollar global industry producing high-stakes pictures costing hundreds of millions of dollars. It's still about star power, but the risks are a lot higher.
Time is at a premium and everything is very expensive, and if some young enthusiastic extra or minor actor in a production decides he's going to have this brilliant seize this moment for himself, he runs the risk of being squashed like a gnat. You have to really have huge balls and be right if you're a part of a much bigger ensemble with other goals other than your own.
Most people are never going to make it in Hollywood. You have to envision a line in front of you with several million people, all attractive, all interesting, all hardworking, all aspiring to the same thing. And It's terribly hard, and ultimately, for most people, terribly disappointing.
The legend of the Hollywood extra lives on. Despite the odds and often harsh realities of making a living as a face without a name in the movies, there still appears to be no remedy for those who have been bitten by the Hollywood bug.
I want to hold out for another very important asset of the extra, is that it was a way that directors used the narrative of the film, to insert us, to get us closer to the proceedings. We are them, or they stand in for us, the extras. And it's a way to cement our relationship to what they are looking at in the film, the actual center of the work. It draws us in even more, the extra does.
It's as though the story of the extra in the world before Central Casting, a world that was full of disappointment, desperation, real hunger, and enough suicide to make it unworkable. It's as though that world couldn't possibly be romantic or sustain itself in romantic American myth.
Early to bed for that beauty sleep. Up at 6, and always hoping that today will be the day Dame Fortune smiles and picks you from the mob.
Once regularized, once made routine, the world of the extra could become the stuff of easy romantic legend, the stuff of ambitious kids with pluck searching for a break, and could then become just that golden thread running through the subsequent history of Hollywood.
If it isn't the best tour you've ever had in Hollywood, you owe us nothing at the end of the tour. We go to homes like Lucille Ball, Elizabeth Taylor, Ronald Reagan.
Swimming pools, tennis courts, and movie stars. The next house is the house of Lucille Ball, probably the most famous house in the city of Los Angeles. We're passing a very lovely home. It was an MGM studio house in the old days. It was also featured in a famous film, Gone with the Wind. This next house on the right belonged to probably one of the greatest actors that will ever live. His name was James Stewart. The 2 palm trees cost $20,000, $10,000 each. Next house belonged to Burt Lancaster. Excuse me, Ava Gardner. I missed it. And it's also the former site of Schwab's drugstore, where Lana Turner was supposedly discovered.